The point is that the authoritarian turn gives rise to the imperial turn and vice versa. So we have this combination right now in Turkey. On the one hand, we have this authoritarian turn in the domestic politics, new regime building, and on the other hand, we have the imperial turn in Turkey. So I'm now by my third point, coming to my third point, debating Ottoman legacy in the Balkans and in the Middle East. The Yugoslav war, the negative perception of Islam after September 11, 2001, and most importantly, Turkey's emerging hegemonic claims on the regional chessboard since 2002 has brought the issue of Ottoman legacy into sharper focus. In general, two tendencies can be discerned in historiographies of Balkan countries living under the Ottoman rule. There is first a negation of Ottoman legacy, and then there is a selective appropriation. With exception of the Muslim, such as Bosniak and a segment of the Albanian society, they have a positive perception of Ottoman Empire, the Muslim, in the Balkans. With exception of these groups, the history of several centuries of Ottoman rule is presented as the Ottoman Dark Age in the Balkans. It's mainly characterized by a fight against the oppressor in form of uprising, search for political independence, and successful preservation of national institutions under foreign domination. This is the one argument in the Balkans. On the other hand, Balkan historiographies are characterized by a process of conversion of Ottoman history into a national one, such as Albanians, Bulgarians, and etc. history under the Ottoman rule. In a similar way, the Ottoman heritage in urban cultures, architecture, cuisine was accordingly transformed into the national one, Bulgarian, Albanian, and Greeks. The main argument is that the Ottoman rule was responsible for the Balkan countries' economic backwardness compared to the Western Europe. Accordingly, de-Ottomanization is offered that operates in parallel to the notion of modernization and Europeanization of the Balkans. This is often presented as the flip side of Westernization, suggested that there was never anything modern in the Ottoman Empire, that the East and West are diametrically opposing. The Balkan states, maintains historian Bernard Lorry, are rushing to catch up with Western Europe, essentially in economic terms, by attempting to get rid themselves of what is seen as the death wave of the Ottoman Empire. The young Balkan states, he goes on, exercised as Jacobinism on their newly acquired peripheries that they tried to justify as a part of the battle against the Ottoman legacy. Under the pretext of the overcoming that legacy, that spreading the civilization, attitudes emerged that were almost colonial, said this historian, in terms of the evaluation of the Balkan history. The same is even more true of the Middle East, and that is my my third point. Yeah, debating Ottoman legacy in the Balkan and Middle East is the part of my third points. Historian Leon Braun has suggested in his study, International Politics and the Middle East, that the political complexity of today's Middle East and region's involvement in great power politics can be explained by reference to what called the Eastern Question. That is the long process of dismembering of the Ottoman Empire without disturbing the European balance of power, from the late 18th century until just after the First World War. Out of this process then emerged an elaborate multiplayer diplomatic game involved many different European states as well as many different Middle Eastern states, veritable states or would-be states. Continuing for generation after generation, Brown maintains, the Eastern question itself created a particular attitude toward politics and diplomacy among the players involved. This pattern of politics, Brown points out, did not, however, came to an end with the final dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. Quite the opposite. The Eastern question, he laconically adds, it still exists. That is, the game is still being played in the Middle East. This is where the nature of political order in the Middle East in the wake of Ottoman Empire comes in. Having considered the concept of legacies in relation to Ottoman Empire and some of its implications for the present-day Middle Eastern and Balkans, we now turn our attention to the process by which the Ottoman Empire was dissolved and its outcome for the Middle East. This is my third point. After the imperial legacy, the new colonial order in the Middle East and its consequences. The end of Ottoman Empire in the wake of First World War resulted in two systemic shifts in the political geography of Middle East, producing two major outcomes of interest. The end of, first, it brought about the British-French mandatory rule in the then Ottoman dominions of Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. The Ottoman rule was replaced by a specific form of governance. Conclusively, the new regime were founded either under the British and French mandatory rule as laid down under the Covenant of the League of Nations or under the indirect Western tutelage as client state, as a policy which was primarily dictated by the fierce geopolitical rivalries for world supremacy between the West and the Soviet Union. Of fundamental significance in this respect was the establishment of the mandate system as stipulated in Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations of 1920. This article provided essentially a three-tiered system of colonial administration. The non-European territories of former Ottoman Empire was classified as A mandates whose existence as independent nation can be provisionally recognized. The classification of mandates territories was made according to the degree of advancement of respective territories, a criterion that also served as a benchmark for the type of colonial administration to be established by mandatory powers. So we have this one historical shift or trends. New regimes were established under the mandatory power after the dissolution of Ottoman Empire, that is under the mandatory rule of France and Great Britain. The second important development was the emergence, or better, the imposition of nation state in the Middle East. The political vacuum which was left with the dissolution of Ottoman Empire was replaced by the establishment of nation state under circumstances where neither state nor nation existed in the sense that's defined in the European context. There was no congruence, no overlap at all between the political and the national unit, between ethnic and political boundaries. Ethnic boundaries cut across political ones so that homogenization could only be achieved by use of power, force. As famously stated by American sociologist Barrington Moore in his seminal study, Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, no bourgeois, no democracy approach sheds some lights on the current situation in the Middle East, but there is more to the story. The post-Ottoman, post-war political order was based on two interrelated processes. The first refers to the policies of external colonization at the hands of the victorious powers of World War I, which took the form of the mandatory regime. The second refers to the process of internal colonization at the hands of emerging nation states and nationalizing elites. Turkey is a paradigm example of the second historical process. This double process can best be described as the coloniality of post-war order in the Middle East. I borrow the concept of coloniality from Latin American debates and relate it to the reconfiguration of political space in the Middle East after the demise of Ottoman Empire. The concept of coloniality was first conceptualized by Annibale Giugiano, I think, and further developed by Walter Mignol. Giugiano refers to coloniality of power to indicate the essentially colonial nature and foundation of current international system, while conceptualizing the process of nation-state formation as a form of internal colonization over conquered space of domination. This analysis offers a powerful insight into our understanding of post-war order in the Middle East and elsewhere, however liberating and historically unique and important it was. The dissolution of Ottoman Empire wasn't necessarily meant to attain self-determination, justice, and emancipation as promised by the victorious power of the First World War. What emerged in its wake, instead, in reality, a double process of colonization. External colonization, as I said, external colonization at the hands of the victorious power of the First World War, and internal colonization at the hands of emerging nation state or nationalizing elite. There emerged nation state that were too weak to challenge or change the prevailing balance of power in the Middle East, but strong enough to implement authoritarian policy in their countries and colonizing policy on their peripheral region left under their rule. In the process, a gradual shift in the balance of power in favor of homogenizing, repressive, and internally colonizing elites took place, which did not surprisingly lead to democratizing and decolonizing policy, but rather to the intensification and empowerment of authoritarian regime still at the helm of power across the Middle East. Colonizing imperial powers and colonizing nation state represents two sides of the same coin. A deeper understanding of interaction between two processes is essential for a proper understanding of the historical legacy as well as current state of affairs in the whole region. It remains to be emphasized that the institution of external colonization through the mandatory regimes at the hands of the Great Britain and France found its corollary in the internal colonization that became dominant form of nation building by the new emerging nationalizing elite. This is by far the most durable outcomes resulting from the reconfiguration of political space in the Middle East after the demise of Ottoman empires. This double process of colonization has uniquely determined the trajectory and character of political order in the Middle East up to now. Some concluding remarks, and I close my, my presentation. Historian Feroz Ahmed has remarked that though the Ottoman Empire is recognized as an empire, few writers discuss Ottoman imperialism. Like other cases of colonial rule that were challenged by national movement, the Ottoman Empire also were forced to decolonize when confronted with emerging nationalism, national movements of their own subjects during and after the French Revolution. In order for that to happen, we have to see the history of Ottoman imperialism, or Ottoman Empire, also as a history of decolonizing attempts. In order for that to happen, more comparative historical study based on process tracing drawn from insights generated by path dependency theory, critical juncture are needed. However, the imperative in moving forward is to maintain the particularities of the empire while at the same time opening it up to comparative analysis. As historian Bernard Lorry, expert on Balkan countries, emphasized, historical narrative has more to do than to justification of national identity. Historical narrative can be inclusive by taking a wider perspective, by broadening our field of vision. He maintains historical research tempers these antagonistic approaches. Considered on the large scale, the Ottoman legacy ceased to be a problem. The real problem is how to overcome the colonizing and predatory nature of the status quo in the Middle East that still accounts for many conflicts and difficulties in the region, while providing an inclusive perspective that offers new way of thinking and working for a shared future. Thank you very much for your attention.